Good evening, everyone. Welcome to you all in this room and to everybody in the overflow. My name is Paul Peppis. I'm the director of the Oregon Humanities Center, and I want to welcome you to this, the first in the OHC's year-long series of lectures on our theme, Humanities. And you can see that the human is in a different typeface than the ities. So let me explain to you the cleverness behind that. Our speakers on this theme will explore a multiplicity of perspectives on the humanities as traditionally understood, fine arts, literature, philosophy, classics, religion, as well as on various and varied aspects of human experience and humanness. But before I introduce our speaker for tonight, I just have a couple of quick announcements. As always, we have an information table right over there where people can find out about upcoming OHC-sponsored and co-sponsored events and where you can sign up for our mailing list. Our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions following the talk and to do a book signing. Because we're live streaming the lecture, people will need to come to the microphones in the aisles. There's one there, there's one over there, to ask your question. It's important that you speak into the microphone so people who are watching online can hear you, and also to maximize the likelihood that everyone who wants to ask a question can ask a question. We ask you to keep your questions and to make them as concise as you can make them. I also need to give my customary thanks. First, many thanks to our collaborators in EMU Event Services and the Center for Media and Educational Technologies for their logistical and technical support. Special thanks, as always, to the OHC's amazing staff, our Associate Director, Julia Hayden, our Program Coordinator, Melissa Gustafson, our Communications Coordinator, Peg Gerhardt, and our Student Assistant, Claudia Sneathan. Last but not least, I want to thank our generous donors and patrons for their financial support. If you want to join their ever-growing ranks in supporting new research in the humanities and great public programs like this, please pick up a donation envelope from the information table on your way out tonight. Without the diligent help of our great staff, collaborators, and supporters, the OHC would never be able to organize events like this and host world-class scholars and public intellectuals like our speaker tonight, Reza Aslan, writer, commentator, professor, and scholar of religions. Aslan will deliver this year's Cressman Lecture. The Cressman Lecture was inaugurated in 1994 with a generous bequest from former UO anthropology professor and archaeologist Luther S. Cressman. The inaugural Cressman Lecture was delivered by N. Scott Momaday in 1996. The lectureship's goal is the presentation and illumination of fundamental humanities issues that confront societies centrally occupied with science, technology, and business. Reza Aslan is an ideal speaker to inaugurate our consideration of humanities and to illuminate fundamental humanities issues confronting our society today, pressing issues that deserve and demand serious and searching attention. Aslan is the author of No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, Beyond Fundamentalism, Confronting Religious Extremism in the Age of Globalization, and most recently, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. He's also the editor of the groundbreaking literary anthology, Tablet and Pen, Literary Landscapes from the Modern Middle East. Not only a brilliant and prolific author and editor, Aslan is a frequent commentator and expert on religion, faith, and identity in the popular media, as well as the executive producer of the talk show Rough Draft with Reza Aslan and the ABC drama of Kings and Prophets, and CNN's upcoming documentary series, Believer. In addition, he is the co-founder of Boom Gen Studios, a transmedia storytelling company that promotes entertainment relating to the people and cultures of the greater Middle East. In all he does, Reza Aslan brings a probing and provocative intelligence determined to illuminate and respond productively to some of our most urgent questions, challenges, and crises. In tonight's Evening with Reza Aslan, he will speak to us about religion, identity, and the future of America. Please join me in welcoming Reza Aslan.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Hi. Hello. Thank you. What a pleasure it is to be here in Oregon. I came off a plane from Los Angeles and I was like, what is this substance falling from the sky? It's like is it the apocalypse? No, really, it's been great. I've had a wonderful day here. I had a chance to talk to some professors and some students, and really delighted to be here before you tonight. I'm just gonna grab Paul, is this your water? Is this my water? Is it? It tastes like you. Is it? It's okay. It's all right. We're friends. So I should just begin just right at the top and admit something to you, that I am an immigrant. I just want to, just in case. I'm clearly here to steal all your punditry jobs, all the punditry jobs that Americans don't want to do. I was born in Iran. My family came to the United States after 1979, after the Iranian Revolution. Grew up mostly in the Bay Area in the 1980s. Not sure if you remember the 1980s. Not the best time in the world to be Iranian or Muslim in the United States. As opposed to now when it's awesome. It's great now. It's great now. This was, of course, the height of the Iran hostage crisis, right? 444 days in which Americans were being held hostage in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And, for a 7-year-old kid trying his hardest not to be weird, to fit in as much as I possibly could, it was important for me to distance myself as much as possible from my culture, my heritage, certainly my religion. I've admitted on numerous occasions that I spent a good part of the 1980s pretending to be Mexican, which tells you how little I understood America, by the way. It didn't help. It didn't help at all. At all. But, for me, it was this kind of unusual experience of seeing, not just navigating, the America at a time in which my very identity was being used to not just be demonized, but to sort of stand for everything that is un-American. But as a child, having to navigate this and maintain, some sense of who I am. I mean, for instance, I'll tell you, when I was a kid, I was a big wrestling fan, WWF, it's not called that anymore, but WWE wrestling. And all my friends were Hulk Hogan fans, right? They all loved Hulk Hogan. And then this was my guy. I was... the Iron Sheik. You don't remember this guy, just trust me. But basically his job was to be the evil guy that, when Hulk would turn his back, he would hit him with a chair, cheat. And then people would yell, USA, and then Hulk Hogan would beat the crap out of him. And this was my guy. This was my childhood, is rooting for this guy. In my 20s, I had to go through the whole process of having my culture, my race be the bad guy in every single movie, which, was kind of hilarious for me, except for one movie. And I'm going to really date myself right here because a lot of you probably don't remember this movie. But do you remember this movie, Not Without My Daughter? Do you remember this movie? Yeah, the old people in the room remember this movie. Sally Field? No? Ringing a bell? This was this movie about this American woman who marries this nice-seeming, normal Iranian man, and it's wonderful, and he's such a good guy and such a sweetheart. And then they go to Iran. And then, whoa, the evil comes out, and, he, takes away her daughter and stuff like that. This movie ruined my sex life. Absolutely destroyed. My dating years, the peak dating years, this movie destroyed it. I am not joking. I can't tell you how many women I would date, and then the second date, they'd be I can't really see you anymore because my mom saw Not Without My Daughter. This was my childhood. But, to be perfectly honest, for me, it wasn't that hard to feel American, despite all of this, despite the fact that my race and my ethnicity and my culture and my religion were constantly being used to define everything that is not American, for me, it didn't really work. I mean, I felt as American as everybody else. See, that's what's kind of remarkable about the American national identity. It's not based on any kind of homogeneity. In other parts of the world, the national identity is deeply embedded in a sense of, cultural homogeneity or ethnic homogeneity, racial homogeneity, but not here. A country that is made up of immigrants can't really rely on that kind of sense of collective identity to define ourselves. And so we use something a little bit different, a little bit more, slippery, which is that we define ourselves, we define our national identity based on adherence to a set of common values, a set of common principles. It's a beautiful idea. It's kind of, frankly, remarkable that it's worked for 200 and something years, but it works. Simple. Doesn't matter what color you are, doesn't matter what ethnicity you are, doesn't matter what culture you are, it doesn't even matter what language you speak. As long as you accept these set of principles, these set of values, you're as American as George Washington. And for me, as a kid, that worked just fine. I had no problem negotiating my Iranian identity with my American identity. And this, by the way, was true even after 9/11. I mean, I think so much has happened in the 15 years or so since the attacks of September 11th, 2001, that we've kind of gotten this collective amnesia about what exactly the world was like in that immediate aftermath. And the fact of the matter is despite the predictions that you heard about this massive backlash against Muslims, that never happened. Yes, there were individual cases of violence against Muslims, but insofar as this notion that the country would turn against its American Muslim citizens, that didn't happen. On the contrary, what you heard most often in those days, if you recall, was that if we are fighting this war of ideology, this war of ideas, then frankly, the best weapon that we have at our disposal is the 3.5 million or so Muslims who are so thoroughly integrated into American society that they should actually be in the forefront of this conflict of ideas, this battle of ideas. But then over the last few years, over the last 5 or 6 years or so, things have started to change, and the polls sort of speak for themselves. Survey after survey has shown unprecedented levels of anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States, the highest it's ever been. In fact, the negativity ratings among Americans for Islam is now 10 to 15 points higher than it was in the immediate aftermath of the worst attack on American soil since World War II. 10 to 15 points higher. You have now more than half of Americans saying that Islam and American values are in conflict with each other. Half of Americans saying that Muslims themselves are just simply un-American. This is a comment that you hear a lot now. I mean, if you look at, for instance, what's happening right now with the whole Colin Kaepernick protest, right? What I found amazing about that is that immediately after that protest became known, Colin Kaepernick was labeled a Muslim. Instantly, he was labeled a Muslim. Oh, well, of course he's protesting against the United States. He's Muslim. He's not Muslim, by the way. He's Christian, as he said repeatedly. But the fact that immediately the thought is, if he's doing something that is, quote, un-American, then he must be Muslim. Now, 55% of Americans have an unfavorable view of Islam. Interestingly, I just want to say one thing that I think is kind of remarkable. That number actually dipped. It was, until about 5 or 6 months ago, more than 60%. Brookings did a new poll and found that it had dropped. And do you know why it had dropped? Because of Donald Trump. Because people were getting so disgusted with Donald Trump that it actually boosted slightly, just a little bit. But we'll take it. We'll take that 5%, just a little bit. It changed the views that Americans have towards Muslims. Now, you look at these numbers and you can understand why we are in the place that we are now, particularly in this election season. And I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about Trump, mainly because when I do so, I sort of throw up in my mouth a little bit. I'm not interested in Trump. I'm not interested in Donald Trump. What I'm interested in is in what he represents. which is something different. I want to talk about not Trump, but Trumpism. Trump himself is an orange-faced clown. This is a man who is an inveterate liar. He is an unapologetic fear-mongerer. He is a misogynist of the worst kind. And he is an absolute, utter racist. An absolute racist. Okay? These are not value judgments. These are not value judgments. These are facts based on decades of accumulated evidence. And every one of us in this country, every one of us in this country is going to have to one day answer to future generations when they ask us, what did you do when this happened? Okay? Every one of us. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. But it's not. By the way, do you know what kind of person has to say the words, I am the least racist person in the world? A racist. That's who has to say that. Trump himself is an aberration, but what he represents is very real. What he has done is tap into a very real and legitimate fear that we cannot deny or just brush aside because of his bombast and idiocy. And that fear is what I want to talk about here. Because that fear is palpable. It's a fear that is rooted in a sense of loss, of racial identity, a sort of feeling of being adrift in a new kind of socioeconomic climate, a changing racial landscape in this country. The fact that the country doesn't feel like it did to a lot of people. And of course, just a random fear of other. Now, we may disagree with these fears. We may think that they're irrational. All fears are in one way or another irrational. But we can't just simply brush them aside. Because no matter what happens at the end of this election, Trumpism is a phenomenon that is here to stay, and we have to deal with it. Now, this fear can be felt across the country in individual situations, individual interactions. We've seen it over and over again in these sort of viral videos, things like this.
You are terrorists. Every one of you are terrorists. I don't care what you say. I don't care what you
It's a little bit, can we turn it up a little bit?
You can say whatever you want. But every Muslim is a terrorist. Period.
Right now.
Shut your mouth. I don't want to hear your mouth. I'm done with you. Everything that I will do, everything that I can do to keep you from doing what you're doing will happen. That will happen.
This, if you remember, was from a little bit earlier in the year, a local council meeting where there was plans to just enlarge a mosque that had been in the community for many, many years, and it completely fell apart as a result of this. That man, listen to that man. He is afraid. That is the sound of fear. This is the sound of fear.
A lot of us here are using either pig's blood or bacon grease on our bullets, packing it in the middle.
Why?
So that when you shoot a Muslim, they go straight to hell. That's what they believe in their religion.
Don't fuck with white people. You see?
Yeah, I see it. What if there's a group of them? Then how would you do it?
Again, no matter how shocked you may be, what you have to understand is that what you are seeing is palpable fear in action. And that fear, of course, has certain consequences. We've seen it throughout the country. 2015 actually set a record for the number of mosque attacks in this country. We're still calculating the 2016 numbers, but it seems as though we may actually exceed the number in 2015. And this includes mosques that have been burned down, mosques that have been vandalized. One of the more sort of popular new ways of doing this now apparently is wrapping mosque doors in bacon. Have you heard about this? This is kind of just a quick note to any Islamophobes who may be listening here in the audience or out in the virtual world. Bacon isn't like Muslim kryptonite. I've always sort of wondered, like, what is it that you think happens if you, like, put bacon on a mosque door? You know what we do when you put bacon on our mosque doors? We remove the bacon. That's what we do. Just a heads up. Of course, threats, attacks against Muslims, and just this year alone, we have seen this actually get to the point where we've had actual murders of Muslims by white supremacists, by people who feel as though they are acting in fear. And so what is it? What are they afraid of? Well, the easiest answer, obviously, is that they're afraid of Islamic terrorism. They're afraid that Muslims are out to get them, that their very lives, the lives of their loved ones, are under threat by Muslims in this country. And while it's certainly true that when you look at what's happening in large parts of the Muslim world, particularly in the Middle East, the violence that has just torn through that part of the world, that these are fearful things. There is a legitimate source of worry and fear there. And for years, we thought to ourselves that, well, at least that's something that's happening over there, that it doesn't really affect us here in the West. But now we know that that's not the case. We've seen these actions take place in Europe. We've seen them in Paris, in Brussels, even in my neighborhood, in San Bernardino, in California. Now, when confronted with this kind of reality, there's usually two responses to it. There are those who say, yeah, but this really just doesn't have anything to do with Islam. And there are those who say, not only does it have to do with Islam, it is Islam. But both of these views miss a fundamental point. On the one hand, I absolutely understand the sentiment that any community of faith has when confronted with radicals and extremists within their community, to distance themselves, to say, well, that doesn't have to do anything with me. That's not part of us. You hear this all the time. And so I get it that Muslims, when they're confronted with something like this, say, well, but that's not Islam. Those aren't Muslims. I totally understand that sentiment. It's just not true. Because you see, a Muslim is whoever says he's a Muslim. It's kind of simple as that. That's it. If you say you're a Muslim, you're a Muslim. The end. If you say that you are acting in the name of Islam, we should take your word for it. It's not helpful to pretend that that's not the case. It keeps us from actually dealing with the very real cancer that has taken root within the Islamic world, this cancer of violence and terrorism. To pretend that it has nothing to do with Islam is ridiculous. Religion is a root cause of religious violence. That's why we call it religious violence. Now, I will say that we are much more likely to make that connection when the religion is Islam than when the religion is something else. So, for instance, when Anders Breivik massacred more than 70 people, 69 of them children, 69 children this man killed, because he thought of himself as a Christian warrior fighting an existential battle against the Islamic takeover of Europe, not a lot of people talked about the Christianity of that part. In fact, most often what we heard was, well, he's insane, he's a little bit crazy, he was radicalized by politics. When Robert Deere walked into a Planned Parenthood clinic because as a devout Christian, he thought he was saving unborn babies' lives and shot up the place, killed an Iraqi veteran, nobody, as far as I know, talked about the role that his religion played in that act of religious violence. So I'm cool with actually blaming Islam for Islamic violence, as long as you're willing to blame other religions for acts of violence carried out in that religion's name. It is something that we have to keep. It is something that we have to remember, because the only way that we can actually confront it is to deal with it in its reality. Now, that is a far cry, obviously, from saying that this is actually the full expression of Islam. I mean, it's one thing to say that ISIS are Muslim, because they say they are, and that's the only thing that makes you Muslim, is you saying that you are. It's a whole other thing to say that Islam is ISIS. And I think that's where the other side gets it wrong. Because if Islam is ISIS, then I need to understand why it is that the vast, vast majority of ISIS's victims are Muslims. Actually, a little more than 4% of those people killed by ISIS are non-Muslim. That means 95.5% of all of ISIS's victims are fellow Muslims. And, by the way, it's not just that the vast majority of ISIS's victims are Muslim, but the people who are on the ground right now fighting back against ISIS, it ain't us. The people who are on the ground fighting back against ISIS, risking their lives, are also Muslim. So if ISIS is Muslim, and the people that they're killing are Muslim, and the people who are fighting ISIS are Muslim, what does that actually say about Islam? Nothing that we can make some sort of easy generalization about. Both of these polarized views about the role of religion in religious violence need to be avoided. We do have to recognize that there is a problem, but we also have to figure out a way to deal with that problem without demonizing an entire religion and everybody that follows it. That said, it is true that this fear that I was talking about is palpable. And let's be honest, many people in this room, you sitting here in this room, you watching at home, many of you are actually threatened by terrorism in this country. Just not Islamic terrorism. You see, the San Bernardino shooting that occurred last year, December of 2015, was the 355th mass shooting of 2015, a year that ended with 372 mass shootings. There are only 365 days in the year. Those mass shootings included 2 that were perpetrated by Muslims. You are in this country more likely to be shot by a toddler than you are to be killed by an Islamic terrorist. According to the FBI, you are more likely to die at the hands of faulty furniture than you are to be killed by an Islamic terrorist. Your lazy boy is more deadly to you than ISIS. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Okay? So yeah, there is a very real threat of terrorism in this country. It's just not Islamic terrorism. Ask the Department of Homeland Security. Not only since 2002 have far, far more Americans been killed by right-wing anti-government terrorism than by Islamic terrorism, but the Department of Homeland Security says that right-wing terrorism is its #1 threat in this country. And by the way, 74% of all law enforcement agencies in this country agree. There is a real threat of terrorism in this country. It's just not Islamic terrorism. And by the way, I just want to be clear, these numbers don't even tell the whole story. Do you know why? Because terrorism is a wastebasket word. That's a polite way of saying bullshit. Terrorism is a bullshit word. It's a word that says far more about the person using it than about the person being described. You don't believe me? Let's go through some of these examples. Dylan Roof. Dylan Roof, radicalized by his anti-government, right-wing, white supremacist ideology, walked into a church in South Carolina, killed 9 people, including an elected government official. Guess what? The FBI said, that's not really terrorism. It didn't count. Wade Michael Page, again, radicalized by his right-wing, white supremacist ideology, walked into a Sikh temple, opened fire, killed 6 people because he thought they were Muslim. So not only is he a murderer and a bigot, he's an idiot. Guess what? The FBI refused to classify that as terrorism. Doesn't count as terrorism. Robert Stack, oh my goodness, this guy. Andrew Stack. This guy wrote a 10,000-word manifesto, an anti-government screed that ended with him declaring that the only legitimate response to this government is violence. He then got into a plane and flew that plane into a government building, killing a government agent. Guess what? It's not really terrorism, according to the FBI. It was not classified as terrorism. Pastor Robert Duggart. This guy ring a bell at all? Last year, he was arrested by the FBI because he had put together an elaborate plan to drive from his home in Tennessee, where he's a pastor, to a city in upstate New York called Islamburg. Yeah, there's a city in New York called Islamburg. Let it go. Where he had planned to, using guns, bombs, and machetes, slaughter as many Muslim men, women, and children as possible. He had already stockpiled the weapons. He was ready to go. The FBI was monitoring him, and they arrested him. Obviously, he wasn't charged with terrorism. You already know that part. You know what he was charged with? Making an interstate threat. And by the way, the judge threw out the charge because he said, well, he made a threat, but there's no reason to think that he was going to actually go through with the threat. Apparently, the only way that this would have actually counted is if he would have actually slaughtered some men, women, and children. Then they would have said, well, okay, now we know that the threat was real. This man is at home watching TV right now. Now, let's just play a fun little mind game, shall we? Let's pretend instead of, Robert Duggart, the Christian pastor from Tennessee trying to kill Muslims in New York, let's pretend this was Imam Duggart, yeah? A Muslim chaplain from New York trying to kill Christians in Tennessee. You think he'd be at home watching TV right now? No. Terrorism is a bullshit word. It's absolutely meaningless. And even with that truth, the Department of Homeland Security says that far, far more Americans have been killed by right-wing terrorists, by white supremacist terrorists, by anti-government terrorists, than by Islamic terrorism. You are not under threat by Islamic terrorism in this country. It is not going to happen. And yet, this is the overwhelming fear of the vast majority of Americans, a large swath of this country. Why? How does that happen? Well, it's not really about Islam. You see, when I said earlier about the miracle of the American identity and about how what's truly astonishing about it is that rather than creating it through some kind of ethnic or cultural or racial homogeneity or religious homogeneity, instead it's built on this notion of acceptance of a set of values, a set of principles. I mean, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thought. It's just that in times of societal stress, it becomes kind of difficult to actually figure out what exactly those values are. The identity becomes somewhat slippery. We have seen this happen throughout American history. Whenever we are confronted with a period of societal stress, of great societal stress, it becomes more and more difficult to actually define what it means to be American. It's a crisis of identity. And as most of you know, when you are in that kind of position, the easiest way to identify yourself is in opposition to an other. It may be difficult to say what it is to be American, but it's really easy to say what it's not. It's very easy to just simply point to an other and say that is representative of what it is to not be American. This has happened throughout our history. Think back to the end of the 19th century. We had a period in the United States of such extreme anti-Catholic hysteria that we actually passed federal laws in this country curbing Catholic migration. It was perfectly mainstream political rhetoric to say that you could not be both American and Catholic. How could you have loyalty to both the Pope and the President? You can't be loyal to both the Vatican and Washington. We actually started to go into convents, because we just assumed that Catholics were stockpiling weapons. This notion, this anti-Catholic sentiment actually resulted in the rise of a political party, the Know-Nothings. You guys read about that in your history books. The Know-Nothings, a political party that came pretty close to winning an election for the presidency. A party that was predicated mostly on this notion that the Catholics were an insidious force within American society, that they were a fifth pillar, that they didn't look like us, they didn't talk like us, they didn't worship like us, that they were not us. And of course, within a generation or so, Catholics were as much a part of the cultural and religious fabric of the United States as anybody else. The same thing happened again in the interwar period. There we saw a level of anti-Semitism unlike anything that this country has seen before. As bad as anti-Muslim sentiment is in this country, it absolutely pales in comparison to the kind of anti-Semitism that we saw in the interwar period in this country. You had people like Charles Coughlin, Father Charles Coughlin, the most popular tent revivalist preacher of his time, going city to city across this country, warning about the Jews as Christ killers. Coughlin's movement was ultimately disbanded by the FBI when they discovered that he was stockpiling weapons in anticipation of this final battle against the Jews. You had paragons of American ingenuity, people like Henry Ford. Henry Ford, right, the icon of American business and entrepreneurship, also despicable anti-Semite, who published the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in his newspapers, like it was news, and then forced his dealerships around the country to sell it. You had people like Charles Lindbergh, right, one of the great American heroes, talking about World War II and even the Holocaust as some kind of Jewish conspiracy to force America into a war, to rid us of our sovereignty. And frankly, a lot of the comments from that period sound familiar. Nearly 2/3 of Americans said we should not bring in Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust. Why? Because they were an insidious force here to transform America. They didn't look like us. They didn't act like us. They didn't pray like us. They were not us. Again, of course, generation or so later, Jews are as much a part of the religious and cultural fabric of this country as anyone else. And those people who a generation before would have probably stood shoulder to shoulder with people like Henry Ford and Charles Coughlin now constantly talk about the Judeo-Christian values upon which this country was built. And for those of you who are not scholars of religion, Judeo-Christian means Protestant, in case you were wondering. Yeah, I've never in my life have I heard a Jew say those terms. How did that happen? How did we go from these sort of anti-Catholic hysteria to Catholics being a part of this country? How did we go from the anti-Semitism of the war period to where we are today? I'm not saying that there isn't anti-Semitism today, but it's certainly not in the mainstream as it was back then. Well, we do know that the same process will probably take place with Muslims, that a generation from now we'll look back at this period with the same sense of embarrassment, the same sense of shame that we look back at these periods. That's guaranteed. The question is how? How do we get there? Well, I'll tell you how we don't get there first. And this is a little bit tricky because oftentimes when I talk to, universities, I'm usually talking to very well-educated people, often fairly liberal. And I think those of us in that camp tend to have this kind of notion, this preconceived notion that bigotry is a result of ignorance, right? That if you're a bigot, it's just because you're ignorant. That's why. And if we could just, educate you, give you information, give you the knowledge that you need to stop being a bigot, you would change your mind. If you're bigoted towards black people, or if you're bigoted toward Muslims or Jews or whatever, it's just because you're ignorant. You're just a lack of information. That's the issue at play here. It's a really beautiful idea. It's just not true, unfortunately. I mean, I know a lot of bigots, and many of them are pretty well informed bigots. Let's just put it that way. Bigotry is not a result of ignorance. Bigotry is a result of fear, right? We're back to fear again. Bigotry is a result of fear. And the problem with fear is that it's impervious to data, right? No amount of information takes away fear. I've got 5-year-olds at home. I mean, there is nothing I can do to convince them that there isn't a monster under the bed. We could turn on the lights. We could crawl under there. It doesn't matter. If they think that there's a monster there, there's a monster there. No amount of information can actually puncture this sense of fear, whether it's irrational or not. Let me give you another example. A large swath of this country, to this day, still believes that Barack Obama is a Muslim. To this day. Let me ask you something. Do you think that there is anything that Obama could do to change their minds at this point? Is there any amount of information, anything at all at this point that he could do to actually change that perception among that broad swath? I mean, Jesus Christ himself could come down and be like, he's with me. And it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter. Actually, to be honest, for a lot of them, they'd be like, yeah, I'm going to take a Jew's word for it. I mean, come on. You know. Jesus was a Jew. Did that come as a surprise to some of you? It's like, we'll talk about that later. Fear is impervious to data. And we're seeing this very clearly with this phenomenon of Trumpism. One of the most interesting pieces of information that has come out of this election when it comes to those people who support Trump, and people support Trump for a whole host of reasons. But one of the things that's really fascinating is that we've discovered that his support is greatest in those provinces. What am I telling? Like we're in Canada. In those precincts that are the least racially integrated, that have the least number of immigrants, and that are the furthest away from the Mexican border. Isn't that weird? So in other words, this overwhelming fear of Mexicans coming into the United States, of immigrants taking our jobs, of the sort of racial politics that is at the root of so much of Trump's political position, the places in which that resonates the most are those places that are least affected by those things. And while that may sound sort of contradictory, for social scientists, it makes perfect sense. We actually have a term for this. We call it contact theory. Contact theory is just a kind of fancy way of saying that it's not about data. It's not about data. Data doesn't change people's minds. The only thing that changes people's minds is relationships. That's it. And it makes sense if you think about it. Because if you are afraid of something, information doesn't change that fear. The thing that changes it is being confronted with that fear. These polls that I showed you earlier that show this incredible spike in anti-Muslim sentiment across the country over the last few years. Again, far, far higher than it was even in the aftermath of September 11th. What these polls have shown consistently when they've been broken down is that the single greatest determinant to a person's views about Islam, it's not their politics, doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. It's not their religion, doesn't matter if you're evangelical or whatever. It's not even where you live in the country, whether it's the North or the South, a red state or a blue state. Those are not the determinants. The single greatest determinant about your views towards Islam is whether you know a Muslim or not. That's it. It's as simple as that. If you know one Muslim, the Washington Post discovered, if you know one Muslim, it cuts in half the negativity rating that you have towards Islam. Obviously. I mean, this isn't like rocket science, right? Because if you know a person, then you can't see that person as the other anymore. You can't use that individual to define yourself against any longer. Because if you know that individual as a human being, instead of as some kind of identity marker, as a nationality or an ethnicity or a culture or a race or a gender or a sexual orientation or a religion, if you know them as an actual human being, then it becomes difficult to recognize, it becomes difficult not to recognize yourself in that person. You can't use them as an opposing pole any longer. I experienced this in my own life. I'm married to an amazing, wonderful, very famous and like earth-shatteringly good Christian woman, Jessica Jackley, for those of you who are interested, founder of Kiva. Yeah, she's the best. And, you know, when we met, you know, we realized that despite the fact that we had different religions, that we shared the same values. We just, you know, expressed those values through a different set of metaphors. And so once we learned each other's metaphors, it was very easy. It's like people always talk to us about, like, how does that interfaith marriage work? And it's like, well, it's like if you're a German person and you marry a French person, you learn French, she learns German, and it's fine. Like, what's the big deal? And it's the exact same thing for us. However, there was this one little hiccup, which is that when we met and we fell in love and we decided that we were going to get married, she had to tell her mom. And her mom, she comes from a very conservative, evangelical Christian family in the Midwest. Her mom, when she found out that we were going to get married, what's the polite way of saying it? Freaked out. I think that's the polite way of putting it. She actually said to my wife, she's like, oh, honey, I don't know if I want my grandchildren to grow up around all that violence. I make fun of her about that every day, by the way. And it's an understandable sentiment that she's expressing, because as she herself openly admitted, she had never in her entire life met a Muslim, ever. She'd gone her whole life. She said to me very clearly, the only Muslims she had ever seen in her life were the ones that she saw on Sean Hannity. So there you go. Actually, worse than that, she referred to Sean Hannity as a journalist. I was like, what? Come on. Sean Hannity doesn't call himself a journalist. But it makes perfect sense. I mean, if the only Muslim that you see is a Muslim that you see on television, then obviously that's how you're going to understand Islam and Muslims. Nick Kristof very famously said that, you know, the way that the media works is that it's built to tell you about the plane that crashed, not the plane that lands. So if the only thing that you know about planes is what you see on the news, you would just assume every plane crashed, because that's how the news works. It's not their fault. It's just that's the function that they serve. And of course, within just a few minutes after finally meeting me, all of her preconceptions, everything that she thought she knew about Islam and about Muslims, all of it went away. And now we have the greatest, I mean, I love my mother-in-law. How many people can say that? I love my mother-in-law. I actually like want to hang out with her and stuff. Also because it's free babysitting. Obviously, right? I mean, obviously, when you know a person, when you see a person as a human being instead of an opposing pole, then you have no choice but to draw a connection with them. Data doesn't matter, relationships matter. Now, I'm not saying that data is totally unimportant, that information or knowledge or education is unimportant. I am a professional educator. I'm actually contractually obligated to say that education is important. Like, they take away your tenure if you say otherwise. And so I've got the data. I could talk to you about data all day. I mean, the data speaks for itself. As I mentioned, there are, little more than 3 million Muslims in the United States. It's about 1% of the population of this country. So for, you know, those of you worried about the inevitable Muslim takeover of America, why don't we wait till we get to 2%? Okay? We'll get to 2%, then we'll take the White House. Again. Nearly 6 out of 10 Muslims in this country are first generation, which indicates that this is more than just about Islam. This is about anti-immigrant sentiment, right? let's just be clear for a moment here that the first Muslims in the United States came here before there was a United States. There were slaves that were brought here on slave ships. So the Muslim footprint in the United States is much older than this country itself is. But there has been, over this generation, a large influx of Muslims from Muslim majority countries, so that now we're in a situation in which 6 out of 10, nearly 60% of Muslims in this country are first generation. 70% of Muslim immigrants are citizens. That's the highest rate of citizenship of any immigrant community in the United States. By the way, while we're on the subject, also the highest rates of literacy, the highest rates of education, and the highest wealth. The median income for a Muslim household in America is larger than for a non-Muslim household in America. And I bring that up not to be gauche, but I bring that up because this is the United States of America, and as we now know, as the Supreme Court told us, your money is your vote. And so that's a very large voice in this country that I think hasn't been tapped. What about this issue of violence, right? Most Americans believe that Islam is unique in that it promotes violence in a way that other religions don't. Well, it turns out that the people at Gallup decided to put this to a test in 2010. They asked a number of religious groups in the United States 10 questions. All 10 had to do with the role of violence. In every single question, Muslims were the least likely of any religious group to accept the use of violence in combat or non-combat situations. In every category, this is just simply one of the questions about the use of violence against non-combatants. In every single category, Muslims were the least likely to accept violence in combat or non-combat situations. In fact, the only group that came even close were the atheists, which makes sense. Poll after poll in this country shows that the most moral community in the United States are the atheists. So let that sink in for a minute, okay? Seriously. Let that one sink in. But again, I got data. I could do this all day. I could sit here all day giving you graphs and figures, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Because honestly, the only data point that matters is this one. 68% of Muslims, 68% of Americans, I'm sorry, don't know any Muslims. Say they've never met a Muslim, like my mother-in-law. Which, by the way, I find a little bit hard to believe. I mean, have you been to a doctor? Chances are he's a Muslim. It's like really the only thing we're allowed to do, like doctor, engineer, lawyer, that's pretty much it. But it's important. It's important to think about this. Nearly 70% of Americans say that they have never actually met a Muslim. Nearly 90% have never been to a mosque. These are the only two data points that actually matter. Because what this shows is that we are in an uphill battle in this country. That if we do actually want to get to the place where we were with Catholics after the 19th century, Jews after the interwar period, that if we want to get to that place, then that responsibility falls on every one of us. By the way, I just want to make it clear that I'm not advocating that the Muslims in the room like go around introducing themselves to people. Like, don't go knocking on people's doors, especially right now. Don't go knocking on people's doors and introducing yourself. This is not an open carry state, right? I didn't think so. No, I didn't think that for a moment. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, however, is that this puts an enormous burden on every one of us, everybody in this room, to figure out for themselves what kind of country they want. Demographers tell us that we are about 10, 15 years away from being the first nation in the world to be majority minorities. I mean, think about that for a minute. The first nation in the world to be majority minorities. This is what the United States has always been. Our strength, our power comes from the unity that we find in our diversity. But that notion, that promise, is in the hands of everybody. Each one of us has to be a representative for the country that we want to live. If it's relationships that changes minds, that changes perceptions, not data, then each one of us is responsible for making that human connection with each other, with the other, whether it's Muslims or whether it's gays or whether it's blacks or whether it's Mexicans, whatever the case may be, whoever the other is, every single one of us is tasked with going out and making that connection, because otherwise we're going to end up living not in the America that we have been promised for 2.5 centuries, but the America that is being threatened by Trumpism and this fear that is gripping so much of the American public. Thank you very much. Okay. So we have 2 mics, right? And I guess you can just kind of walk up to those mics and ask me any question you want to. I don't mind. And if you got a statement, you can make a statement. I find sometimes statements elicit like a better conversation than questions do sometimes. Yes, ma'am.
Hello. Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, my name's Habiba, and I'm a Muslim.
Hey! I like how you did that like this is an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. You know?
That was the plan.
I've been a Muslim for 18 months now.
I found it really interesting what you were saying about fear and that being kind of the gross sum of what causes bigotry. My question is really for Muslims living in America, while those bigots are figuring out their fear, which could take a really long time, do Muslims have a responsibility, you think, to help them overcome that? And if so, what should Muslims in small-town America or big-town America be doing to help them?
This is such a tricky question because as a Muslim and as someone who talks to a lot of Muslims, particularly young Muslims, this notion that you hear so often, particularly from the elders and the people who are preaching the kinds of things that I'm preaching, usually involves making each individual Muslim a representation of their entire religion, and that's a lot to ask. That's a really lot to ask. To ask some 16-year-old Pakistani American teenager to answer for like every horrible thing ISIS does every time it does it is absurd, and I completely sympathize with this kind of movement, this no apology movement that you hear so much about from young Muslims, that it's not my job to apologize for what Muslims do. It's not my job to defend Islam. Like, I'm just a kid, just leave me alone, I want to mind my own business. I totally get that, absolutely sympathize with it. I would say, on the other hand, that we are in a situation in which our very identity, our very sense of self, is not only being demonized, it's being marked as quintessentially other. It's being seen as the enemy. And as uncomfortable as that situation is for a lot of us, it does create, I think, a burden and a responsibility. Not to engage in theological arguments with people. That's not what I'm talking about. Not to sit here and try to explain the socio-political context of the rise of jihadism in Iraq and Syria. Like, that is not your responsibility. But it does mean that who you are as an individual, the values that you project in your day-to-day life, have a far greater meaning than just your individual experience. That how you comport yourself, how you relate to the people around you, particularly those who don't share your ethnic or your religious identity, actually bears an enormous amount of weight on the way that perceptions in this country are formed. So what I would say is, if you are a Muslim, and if you feel that your very sense of self is under siege, and you do want to change the way that your community, your country understands and perceives you and your culture and your faith, the best way to do that is to just simply be yourself, to be the person that you are, to express the values that are at the very heart of your faith tradition. That in and of itself can create a sea change in this country. Is it a lot to ask? Yeah, it is. It is a lot to ask. But at the same time, I think that we are in extraordinary times, and it's really difficult to avoid. Is that working? We'll just use one mic. That's fine. Oh, maybe it's you, Charles.
Hi,
Okay, there we go.
I'm Charles. I'm really glad to see that you're saying the things that you're saying. My question is, how much do you think you're reaching outside of the bubble? Are you just preaching to the choir when you talk to everybody when you go around?
Maybe in this room. I mean, look, I know where I am, but I mean, this is a message that I give no matter where I go. I mean, whether I'm speaking to conservative audiences or more liberal audiences. I mean, I spoke at a school in Texas just last week. That when I, mentioned what a piece of monkey shit Donald Trump is, pardon me, the response was quite different, as you can imagine. But nevertheless, I mean, I think that this is a message that resonates with people because, look, what I love about this, one of the things that I really love about this country is the extraordinary sense of patriotism that you find regardless of whether you are on the left or on the right. There is a sense that there is something special here. Yeah, we muck it up a lot. But the idea that we have something that at the very least we try to hold on to, something extraordinary, something unlike, something utterly unique, something that has led us to this place where we are about to reach this incredible milestone. And by the way, if you want to really, really understand how crazy that statement that I made was, that we're about to become the first nation to be majority minorities, if you really want to understand how insane that is, take a second and try to think of what the second nation will be to reach that milestone.
France?
Maybe. I mean, the difference between the United States and France is precisely that sense of identity that I was saying. Here, what we say is that identity is organic. It's about the values that we hold dear and about the way that we come together based on those values and principles. In France, they say, we will tell you what those values are. Yeah. And you change your culture and your identity so that it fits with what we say it's supposed to be. That's not how it works around here. It really is quite miraculous. What I'm trying to say is that where I really find common ground, regardless of the political affiliation of the audience that I speak to, is in this understanding of what it is that makes America extraordinary and unique, and the responsibility that all of us have to maintain what is a very fragile thing. I mean, I think, we've had a little more than 200 years of this, and so we just assume that this is a permanent state of affairs. That's not how it works. And so we have to constantly be struggling to maintain that sense of unity in our diversity. And that's an argument that I think that most Americans, regardless, again, of where they fall in their politics, that's an argument that resonates with them. Yes, sir.
Hi, on a personal note, the first time I saw you was on the Bill Maher show,
Oh, yeah.
before I read your book, so there's always a little bit of magic to see the person in real life after I see them speak. So thanks for coming. You mentioned France before. I grew up in Europe. I moved to the United States 2 years ago, and I try to tell the Americans, in France, the equivalent of the Hispanic immigrant is the Muslim immigrant.
Perfectly said.
So I would like you to, if you can, I think the way you explained Islamophobia in the United States from a historical perspective was very logical to me. In France, I do feel that people are more exposed. They do have more contact with the Muslim religion. It's the primary minority. And yet, we are seeing that the National Front Party is doing very well. It's growing. How do you explain that they have this contact, and yet this sentiment is growing?
No, it's a really good question. I think you said it really well at the beginning, that when you look at the experience of Muslim immigrants in Europe, not just in France, but in Holland, in Germany, in the UK, when you look at the Muslim experience there, it's so vastly different than the immigrant experience in the United States, right? If you're a Muslim from a Muslim majority state who immigrated to the United States, you did so because you could. That means that you had the education and the wealth necessary to actually get here. Whereas the immigrational patterns in Europe for Muslims was vastly different. The majority of Muslim immigrants and their children are from the post-war period. These were Muslims from Algeria and Morocco and in Egypt and Tunisia who were brought into Europe as guest workers and were tasked with the responsibility to clean up the devastation of that war. They were never, ever given an opportunity to actually integrate into European society. On the contrary, they were purposely herded into ethnic enclaves. Yeah. They weren't given an access to citizenship. This may sound weird from an American perspective because, if it doesn't matter how, what your ethnic background is. If you're born in the United States, you are instantly an American citizen. It doesn't matter if, your mother showed up 3 seconds before you were born. You were as American as anybody else. That's just how we do it here. That ain't how it's done in large parts of Europe. In Germany, until they changed the law in 2010, in Germany, if you were born in Germany, if your father was born in Germany, but your grandfather was born in Turkey, you're not a German citizen. You actually have to apply for German citizenship. When you are in a situation in which you have, and then by the way, of course, there's the poverty, right? That the wealth of the American Muslim community is so much higher than it is for the Muslim communities in Europe, which is why I think your explanation that if you really want to compare immigration patterns between Muslims in Europe and in the United States, then what you're really looking at is Mexican immigrants and immigrants from other parts of Latin America. That is a much more apt comparison. That has resulted, of course, in a sense of really a lack of identity for a lot of Muslims, a feeling that they don't belong, that they are not welcomed in Europe. Many of these Muslims were born in Europe, and so they don't have really any connection to the country of their culture, whether it be Pakistan or whether it be in North Africa, and so they feel completely adrift. They don't belong here, they don't belong there. The reason why the siren call of these transnational jihadist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda resonates so much among European Muslim communities and doesn't at all among American Muslim communities is precisely because it comes with this well-packaged sense of identity. The argument that a group like Al-Qaeda makes is, well, the reason you don't feel either British or Pakistani, either Turkish or German, either Algerian or French, is because you're none of these things. Your identity is defined solely by your religion, your membership in this global community, and so therefore your responsibility is solely to this global community. It's a very powerful, very appealing message that you can understand why it resonates among young people. And particularly when you live in a country like France, as I said. I was making jokes about it, but the fact of the matter is that France and the aggressive secularization that they impose upon their citizens makes life very difficult for a lot of Muslims who want to actually express their religious identity. Now, I get it that the argument of the French is, well, we apply these rules equally, right? So the fact that a girl cannot go to a public school in France if she chooses to wear a headscarf is not really anti-Muslim bigotry, because we wouldn't let her wear, a crucifix either. Yeah. What? A crucifix you can put on a shirt, but a headscarf is impossible to hide. So that just means that you have no access to that schooling if you choose to express your religious identity. And so we have these absurd situations like the burkini ban, which is just atrocious in every way. You have a government that essentially says, well, if you choose to cover yourself, it's clearly not your choice. It's clearly something that is being imposed upon you by someone else. So therefore, we're going to force you to not wear it. This is seen, rightly so, as an attack on a person's very sense of self, a very sense of identity. And it results, as we have seen over and over and over again, in these violent outbursts, this backlash among French Muslims. That is a problem that is quite unique to the European Muslim experience, and one that really doesn't apply in the United States. As I said, it's very easy, regardless of what your race or religion or your ethnicity or your background is, to feel American, because all you have to do is say, yeah, I agree with these things, these ideas, and I will make it my own, but I'm as American as anybody else. If a French person can't even tell you what it means to be French, how does a French Algerian figure that out, right? So I think that's the real issue here, is it's a different kind of identity crisis.
Thank you very much.
Yes,
Hi, thank you. That was wonderful. My name is Jonathan, and Jesus, Muhammad, and Moses walked into a bar. That's not where I'm going with this.
Only two of them got served.
Right. Exactly. Well, Muhammad on this after hours. So my question's about Jesus, actually. I'm interested to know how your relationship with Jesus through historical research, your personal relation, how has that influenced your view of America, the laicite, the common culture of America, the civic religion of America is Christian, maybe not the official religion. As a Jew, I've struggled with that my whole life. I'm interested to know how you deal with Jesus, and is he right for you in what way, and what? I just want to hear your relationship with Jesus.
Well, I think some of you may know that when I was in high school, I joined an evangelical youth group and converted to a particularly conservative brand of evangelical Christianity, and then kind of made it my mission to preach the gospel as I had heard it to anyone, whether they wanted to hear it or not, frankly. And when I went to college, I decided that I was going to do this for a living, that I was going to study the New Testament for a living. And it didn't take long for me to recognize that pretty much everything that I thought I knew about Jesus was incorrect. If not incorrect, then incomplete. And as I often say, I was introduced to a different Jesus. I had been familiar with the Christ of faith, but I had never met the Jesus of history. And the only thing that I can say is that the Jesus of history was way more interesting to me. Being confronted with this poor, and when I say poor, I mean like poorest of the poor, marginal, Jew from the backwoods of Galilee, like the equivalent of what we would refer to as a country bumpkin, who, with the power of his charisma and his teaching, managed to gather a movement, a small movement, but a movement nonetheless, of the dispossessed, of the marginalized, of the weak, of the left behind, a movement that was seen as such a threat to the greatest empire the world had ever known, that he was hunted down, captured, tortured, and executed for the crime of sedition against the state. Call him Bob. That sounds like the most interesting man in the world. Like, forget about, everything else that has been said about Jesus. Like, if that's the only thing you know about him, that's a guy worth knowing. And so I think for me, when I was confronted with that person, I just thought, that's the person I want to know. That's the person that I want to follow. And although I abandoned Christianity and went back to Islam, I think I sort of became even a more devout follower of the Jesus of history than I ever was of the Christ of faith. And, you're right that there is, Jesus is, as I've discovered recently, it's a touchy subject. Who knew?
Just a little.
Apparently, people take Jesus kind of seriously. But, we live in a country that is 70% Christian, right? 7 out of 10. 7 out of 10 Americans are Christian. 7 out of 10 Americans are Christian. I'm just going to let that sink in for a minute here. 7 out of 10 Americans are Christian. Really? Because that's what Pew says. 7 out of 10 Americans check the box on the Pew form that says they are Christian. I want to ask you a question. And I know I'm going off topic here for a minute, but this is important. Do you think 7 out of 10 Americans go to church on a regular basis? Do you think 7 out of 10 Americans read the Bible? Do you think 7 out of 10 Americans can tell you anything about Jesus except that he was born in a manger and died on a cross? No. This is an instructive moment here, because the vast majority of that 70%, when they say, I am a Christian, they are making an identity statement, not a faith statement. This is true of all religions. Religion is first and foremost a matter of identity. It is not a matter of beliefs and practices. I am not saying that beliefs and practices are not important. They're just secondary. When someone stands up and says, I am Christian, I am Muslim, I am Jewish, I am Buddhist, I am Hindu, they're not making a faith statement, they're making an identity statement. And as a matter of identity, that statement is wrapped up with all the other factors, all the other markers of your identity, be it your nationality or your ethnicity or your race or your gender or your sexual orientation or your politics or your class or your socioeconomic position. You cannot divorce your religion from those things. Religion has never existed in a vacuum, and it just doesn't. Every single one of us that associates with a faith community does so by enwrapping that sense with everything else that makes us us. That's why if you get two people to read the exact same piece of scripture, they will walk away with two radically opposing views. In this country, both slave owners and abolitionists not only use the same Bible to argue their viewpoints, they use the same verses. They use the same exact verses. If that is not an indication that religion is just a matter of identity, then I don't know what is.
Right. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. I got to start. I'm going to make this faster. Sorry.
All right. Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a freshman and a religious studies major here at the U of O.
Yay.
Yeah. So my question is, what can religious studies majors and people of my do to kind of help the current climate and help the current situation of Muslim Americans?
Great. I can answer this very quickly because I said it earlier today. I think the most important skill that any student, regardless of what your discipline is, can learn is religious literacy. We are in a world in which an increased number of people are beginning to identify themselves by their religion, right? More and more people are giving primacy to their religious identity than to their national identity. right? 100 years ago, a person would say, well, I'm Egyptian and I'm Muslim. I'm American and I'm Christian. 100 years later, you're more likely to hear, well, I'm Muslim and I'm also Egyptian. I'm Christian and I'm also American. That is an extraordinary phenomenon, and it's happening all over the world. And it requires, I think, regardless of again, what field you're going to, whether it's politics or law or entertainment or business, whatever, in a globalized world, if you lack religious literacy, you are not in a position to succeed in the world that we live in now. So good for you that you're studying religion, but regardless of what you're studying, you should at least take one religion class. Take one world religion class. Trust me, it'll benefit you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm the art conservator at the Jordan Snitzer Art Museum, and we're preparing to do Sandow Burke's American Quran.
Oh, great.
Which you wrote an essay, which
Yeah.
I was introduced to you. And we're facilitating conversations with students and the community as well. So I thought if you could take a few minutes to kind of expand your thoughts on your essay, and also if you could sort of give us a direction. I mean, your speech kind of answered it, is build relationships.
So tell me, where is this and when?
Oh, the Jordan Snitzer, which is right behind us.
Okay, the Jordan Center, okay, and when?
And it'll be in January, right, Debbie?
In January. Okay, January 21st, Jordan Center.
Can you come? Do you want to come?
I'll see. If you have not seen this amazing exhibit, American Quran, you've got to see it. It's remarkable. What Sandow has done is take an ancient tradition, which is the written form of the Quran, the handwritten form of the Quran, translated it into English, and then added it's incredible art that's representative of Americana, like, monster trucks and in and out fast food chains, and it's beautiful, it's remarkable, it's so powerful. But I think what's truly amazing about it is that whether he was aware of what he was doing or not, he is essentially walking in this sort of well-trodden path, this notion that the Quran has for 14 centuries been transformed by every community that encounters it. And the way that he has done this, by taking these sort of images, these glimpses of, what we think of when we think of America, and juxtaposed it with the words of the Quran, it's remarkable. I mean, I'm just going to give you the whole advertising for this. So January 21st, the Jordan Center, American Quran, don't miss it. Thank you. Yes?
Hi. So this is something that perplexes me.
I'm going to probably have to say that gentleman is, because these poor people have to leave. So I'm going to do these two, and and then maybe you and I can have a conversation afterwards. Is it a good one? All right, okay.
Okay. So, can I go? Yeah?
Yes.
All right. So despite all the hatred and fear and violence toward Muslims and other immigrants in America, so many still choose and want to come here. What is it that makes America so appealing? I know, way back in the day, it was the American dream. Anybody could become anything. It was the melting pot of the world, all that. But that doesn't seem like what it is anymore. What still makes it so appealing?
Yeah, mostly monster trucks and In and Out.
Good answer.
The bulk of it. No, look, it's a very serious question, and I do have a very serious answer, which is the free exercise of thought. I know for most Americans, I wasn't born here, okay? I came here when I was 7 years old. I spent a good deal of time as a legal immigrant, and then I was an illegal immigrant for a long, long time. And I became a citizen when I was 23 years old. So I was a conscious adult when that decision was made. When those questions were asked of me, when I was asked, will you defend the Constitution with your life against all enemies, foreign and domestic? That was a serious question to a person who could answer it in a conscious way. And I answered yes. And I think that the reason is because this notion that you're in a place where you could express yourself, your beliefs, your views, your ideas, without fear of reprisal, without fear of government censorship. It's such an unusual thing, even in the so-called developed world. I know that we're hearing all this conversation. Trump is talking about, I'm going to sue the newspapers. Yeah, that's not how it works in America. That is how it works in Europe. You can sue a newspaper. There are these very loose libel laws in Europe. You can say whatever you want to here. In Germany, if you say that only 5 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, you can go to prison. Now, that's a lie. 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. It's absolute nonsense. But if you want to be a anti-Semite, espousing anti-Semitic views, as grotesque as those views are, it's cool in America because you have free exercise of thought. That is extraordinary. And I don't think that we can diminish it in any way. Yes, okay, economic situations have changed, and you're right, the American promise isn't what it was before. But that aspect, the notion that here you can think what you want, you can express how you feel without fear of reprisal, I can't explain to you how unique, how extraordinary that is. That's why people still come here.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Dr. Aslan, thank you so much for being here tonight. I first just wanted to say, sorry for the little fanboyness, but no God but God is one of the reasons that I came to Islam, so thank you.
Oh, fantastic, thanks.
And my question for you is, what books are you reading right now?
What am I reading right now? Well, I'm 2.5 months from turning in a book. So I don't read anything. I don't enjoy anything. I pretty much hate everything. That's pretty much my life right now. I hate myself. If you've written a book, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm at that place where I just loathe it all. But mostly when I do read, I read fiction. That's what really kind of animates me. Even when I'm working on nonfiction, fiction, especially fiction writers who understand the craft of sentence formation. Right? My writing professor said something to me that I have always remembered as sort of the foundation of my writing process, which is that writing happens at the level of the sentence. And so for me, all I care about is a beautiful sentence. That's the only thing. I don't care what the story is. It doesn't matter. If you've got beautiful sentences, I will read you forever. So that's kind of where I am right now. Thanks, though.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, glad to have you here, sir. Comment and a question. John Boyajian, grandson of immigrants and Marine veteran. And fair to Donald, well, there may be some of us that feel the same adjectives apply, to the good sir here, especially the last one. Now, in fairness, rebuttal. Thank you. And the question is, what, in an honest response, and I'll list the Islamic countries, what would happen to you if you were to preach religious freedom, freedom to build churches, synagogues, freedom for women in the countries, Islamic countries of Iran, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Egypt, Somalia? What would happen to you? And thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So let's take those countries one at a time. Ethiopia is a Christian country, but besides Ethiopia, what would happen if I preached it in Saudi Arabia? I would I'm an American citizen, so I can do anything that I want to. But let's pretend that I'm not an American citizen, okay? Let's pretend that I'm not an American citizen, and I preached what I preached today in Saudi Arabia. I would be in serious trouble. I would probably be arrested and never heard from again in Saudi Arabia. What would happen to me in Somalia? Nothing. What would happen to me in Egypt? I'd probably run for office. What would happen to me, what was the other, in Afghanistan? Honestly, I would just probably get the hell out of Afghanistan as fast as possible right now. Not a great time to be in Afghanistan. No, I'm joking, but I do want to emphasize this because this is really an important point, that oftentimes when we talk about the problem of Islam and issues of lack of human rights, etc., lack of women's rights, these are very real phenomena that have to be taken seriously. But we have to take them seriously in a country-by-country way. So often when people say, oh, the problem with Islam is that, women aren't allowed to drive. Well, yeah, there is a country, that's true. There is a country among the 30 or 35 or so Muslim majority countries in the world in which women cannot drive. And yet there have been 9 times in which Muslim women have been voted as president or prime minister of Muslim majority countries. So, you know what I mean? Like, you have to recognize that there is a problem with Saudi Arabia. That's true. That's true. But to then expand that problem and make it a problem with the Islamic world is ridiculous. Iran is a great example. Absolutely true. Women do not have the same legal rights as men in Iran, and that's a travesty. It's atrocious. At the same time, there were actually, until the previous election, more women in the Iranian parliament than there were women in both houses of the US Congress combined. And the Iranian women's movement is unquestionably the most vibrant, robust women's movement in all of Islam. All of this is to say that while we cannot ignore the fundamental fact that there are Muslim majority countries in the world in which there is a lack of human rights, in which women do not have the same legal rights as men, that is a true statement, and we can't brush that aside. To pretend that Iran is Turkey, or that Saudi Arabia is Indonesia, or that Pakistan is Malaysia, is absurd. And so we do have to recognize that, and by the way, if we are actually interested in doing something about it, we really have to recognize it. If it's just a rhetorical point, that's one thing. But if you actually do want to address the problem of women's rights in Saudi Arabia, or women's rights in Iran, then it behooves us to not confuse these national problems, these state problems, and these issues that are so much tied with local customs and cultural practices with the larger question of Islam and human rights, or Islam and democracy, or Islam and modernity. I mean, let's not forget that 1/3 of the world's 1.5 billion Muslims live in democracies, that the world's largest Muslim country, Indonesia, is a democracy, that the world's second largest Muslim country in the world, Turkey, is a democracy, that we can't just simply continue to make generalizations about Islam based on these 2 or 3 very real, very horrific examples of oppression of women, oppression of minorities, oppression and lack of religious freedoms that we have in places like Iran and Saudi Arabia, etc.
Hi, this is Jonathan. I was wondering, when people who are not Muslim are trying to critique the radicals in the Muslim community, but trying not to alienate the people who are Muslim, who we want to be our allies in the same fight. We don't want to create an us versus them. We want to, hey, I know that you're not the bad guy. It's this guy. But we are critiquing certain things about your beliefs that this person is using to justify his actions.
No, look, I think that there is absolutely nothing wrong with critiquing beliefs, with critiquing practices. Of course you should do that. If you disagree with any kind of ideology, you should critique it. There is a difference, however, with critiquing a belief or a practice and labeling an entire community as the same, equating every member of a community with the radicals and the extremists of that community. It's actually not that difficult to do. I mean, we have these conversations all the time where people say, oh, well, if you criticize an abhorrent practice in Saudi Arabia or in Afghanistan or Iran, you're immediately labeled an Islamophobe. No, you're not. What is who is labeling you an Islamophobe for saying that women should be able to vote in Saudi Arabia? Nobody is doing that. It's when you then say that this is inherent to Islam, and so therefore all Muslims feel as though women should be degraded or marginalized. That's when you're called an Islamophobe, because you are making absurd generalizations based on extreme examples. It's pretty simple. And that, by the way, is true of all generalizations, I would say, regardless of whether you're talking about a religion or a race or a culture.
All right, well, thank you.
Okay, this better be good. I mean,
I'll do what I
I'm
can
really
do.
like...
Okay, I just want to say salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Yeah, thank you for coming. It's a great talk and something we all need to hear. This is a very secular audience that we have here in Eugene, and I'm hoping maybe you'd be willing to say something about Islam, what it means to you, something positive about it that would close the night out.
I am a person of faith. I believe that there is something beyond the material realm. I believe that whatever that thing is palpable, it's knowable, and I seek to know it. I seek to commune with it. I recognize that that thing is utterly beyond the human experience. It is inexpressible in the extreme. And so I need some way to express it. I need some way to talk about it. I need some way to think about it. And so I require a language to help me, not just to understand it, but help me to communicate this feeling, this knowledge that I have that there is more beyond the material realm. The language that I use has to be a language of symbols and metaphors, because there's no other way to talk about this thing except in metaphorical terms, except in symbolic terms. Well, this is the great thing about religion, is that it's a ready-made set of symbols and metaphors. It's a language that's there for the taking if you want to. It allows you to communicate these fundamentally inexpressible ideas to other people and have a conversation about them. So pick a language. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're speaking French or German or Spanish. You're saying the exact same thing. Pick a language, whether that language is Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism or Islam or whatever. It makes no difference. Don't confuse the metaphor for the thing itself. And for me, the language that I like, the symbols and metaphors that make the most sense to me, are the symbols and metaphors that are given in Islam. But I don't think that Islam is more true. I don't think Islam is more right or more correct. The Buddha once said that if you want to strike water, you don't dig 6 one-foot wells. You dig 1 6-foot well. Right. Islam is my 6-foot well. But the Buddha also recognized that the water that you are drawing from is the water everybody is drawing from. So pick a well, but recognize that the water is universal. Simple as that. Okay. I feel like, I swear this is going to be quick. Now, you know that the #1 rule is like walk away when you get applause. Like, thank you. That's it. Thank you very much. But I'm sticking around for you. I'm sticking around for you. Yes,
I appreciate that. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam. How are you?
My daughter is 13 years old. And right now she's really passionate about debate. And she aspires to be a U.S. president, hijab and all.
Yeah.
But will we vote for her? Is America ready to vote a Muslim woman, hijab and all, to the presidency of the United States? Thank you.
Yeah. You know what? I think that's a question for every one of us to consider. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you, everyone. Good night.